In this poetry analysis, 5 different poems will be compared using 3 inquiry questions, which investigate the mood and messages of the poems, as well as how the reader is positioned to respond to them. The first inquiry questions how 2 of the poets present their key messages to the reader. For this, Vultures and Goodbones will be analysed. Chinua Achebe, writer of Vultures, and Maggie Smith, writer of Goodbones, utilize differing techniques, including juxtaposition and repetition, to establish the common message that both good and evil exists in the world. Juxtaposition is heavily incorporated between and within the stanzas of Vultures, highlighting not only evil and love, but also the fundamental similarities between instinctive animals and humans. The first stanza primarily shows the evil aspect of the symbolic vulture, describing its gorging of a swollen corpse, which is then starkly contrasted with the bird's affectionately inclined nature in the first and second stanza. The vulture symbolizes society's tendency for animosity and destruction, while simultaneously highlighting society's delicacy and compassion. Stanza 3 follows the life of a commandant at the Belsen concentration camp in World War II. He is initially portrayed as evil with fumes of human roast clinging rebelliously to his hairy nostrils, which again contrasts with the description of him visiting a sweet shop to pick up a chocolate for his tender offspring. These contrasts clearly establish the message that good and evil exist in the world, with a vulture with generally negative connotations has loving capabilities, and an inhumane Nazi commandant is capable of gentle love. Achebe's juxtaposition of perspectives prompts the audience to assess their interactions and events through multiple perspectives. Dissimilarly, Goodbones, rather than using detailed juxtaposition, utilizes the repetition of the phrase, "the world is at least half or 50% terrible," after descriptions of good and bad events, to clearly address the synchronicity of positivity and negativity within the similar events. Additionally, in Vultures, Achebe's vivid imagery depicts vultures picking the eyes of a swollen corpse in a waterlogged trench, emphasizing instinctual evil. Similarly, Goodbones uses emotive language and words of high modality to emphasize evil. Modality is used to assure the audience that evil does exist, which can be seen when Smith discusses that for every bird there is a stone thrown at a bird. Furthermore, emotive language such as broken, bagged, and sunk in a lake is used when discussing the death of a child to emphasize the presence of evil. Vultures and Goodbones use differing techniques of juxtaposition, repetition, imagery, emotive language, and modality to convey the message that both elements of good and evil exist in all things, and urges the audience to reflect on their own malicious and instinctual actions. The second inquiry asks how the reader is positioned to respond to the key ideas in Caged Bird and Still I Rise. Maya Angelou, the writer of Still I Rise and Caged Bird, uses similar poetic techniques of emotive language and juxtaposition, and the poems have a shared theme of unjust racial discrimination towards African American people. However, the intended response from Caucasian culture differs slightly between the poems. Emotive language is imperative to these poems to elicit a meaningful response from the reader. Still I Rise incorporates confident language to show that African Americans will rise above white oppression. Angelou asks white Americans if her sassiness upsets them or if her haughtiness offends them, whilst continually presenting African Americans with emotionally stable characteristics, such as humor and happiness, that white culture does not enjoy. Angelou's confident emotive language in Still I Rise appears to irritate white culture. Contrastingly, Caged Bird uses melancholy emotive language to develop a sense of sorrow in the audience. Caged Bird discusses how African Americans from the civil rights movement could seldom see through their bars of rage, with their freedom clipped and tied, their life filled with nightmare screams, and are eventually standing on a grave of dreams by the end of their life. These highly emotive phrases create a sense of sadness in the reader, positioning them to respond negatively to the treatment of African Americans. Furthermore, juxtaposition contributes to the intended response, with Still I Rise continually contrasting attempted white oppression with black prevalence, showing white culture that their tyrannic rule is unsuccessful, thus eliciting an irritated response. Caged Bird, however, compares the privileged life of white culture against the caged life of African Americans to evoke a remorseful response. Angelou uses common techniques in 2 poems to induce irritated and sorrowful responses from the target audience, being white culture and the civil rights movement. The third inquiry investigates the mood created in Dear Mr. President and Caged Bird, and what techniques have been used to create that mood. Varying techniques of allegory, rhetorical questions, and foreshadowing are used to create a troubled mood in Dear Mr. President by Pink and Caged Bird, by creating an overarching theme of unethical social or political rule, which is instinctually troubling. Caged Bird uses metaphor and the foreshadowing of a restrictive life to create a troubling mood. Angelou discusses the metaphorically caged, tied, and restricted lives of African American people during the civil rights movement. as well as how an ignorant, free bird, representing the privileged Caucasian majority of the United States, is able to hear the fearful trill of the caged bird, who sings for freedom, yet disregards the plight of the caged bird, and continues to bask in the beautiful orange sun rays of the morning. Contrastingly, Dear Mr. President's lyrics are predominantly comprised of direct rhetorical questions, rather than metaphors, towards President Bush, which regard his state of mind in spite of his negative and stated policies and personal ethics which detriment society. Topics including the Iraq War, the No Child Left Behind Act, opposition to gay marriage and rights, his seeming lack of empathy for poor and middle-class residents, and his previous whiskey and cocaine addictions develop a troubling political allegory. Rather than utilizing rhetorical questions to give the message poignancy, Angelou allows the audience to build these questions independently after processing the bird's eternal plight. With a theme of racial discrimination, Caged Bird has an inherently troubling mood, accentuated by the use of repetition, which foreshadows perpetual oppression. The repetition of the caged bird singing for freedom throughout the entire poem implies that his life will be forever restricted, which is a fundamentally troubling reality. Dear Mr. President and Caged Bird establish a troubling mood through the use of metaphor, rhetoric, and repetition, urging the audience to contemplate their position on racial and controversial political topics.